First, let's examine the factors that affect the accuracy of PC2's object recognition. First of all, by default, it processes and transmits 60 frames per second, which means 60 pieces of data per second. But you can adjust this setting. So depending on this, the accuracy can be highlighted, and in the case of PC2, well, generally, let's just call it color. When recognizing objects based on color, if two objects have very similar colors or very similar hues, they can be recognized as the same object. And through the various corrections explained later, these errors can be reduced. As I explained last time, if you go into the settings and click on the gear icon, in the Pixelmon section, this screen will appear. On this screen, you can use the tuning tab and the signature mode, which I explained as modes. By setting the range values corresponding to each desired mode, you can adjust the level of recognition. For example, after training, it can recognize even small parts of objects in the background. By adjusting this, it can recognize more narrowly within the internal area, or by appropriately adjusting the correction values, it can recognize only the desired object accurately. By setting the signature range, you can adjust the recognition range to be just right. Next, you can set the frames per second. If you go into the settings and then the camera tab, you will see mean frames per second, which is set to 60 by default. This means 60 frames per second. However, if the environment where you are using PixieTool is somewhat dark, you can reduce the frames per second to improve performance. But keep in mind that if you lower the frame rate, the Arduino or Raspberry Pi that uses the data from PC2 will receive fewer data points per second. Originally, it would receive 60 data points per second, but with this setting, it might receive only 24 data points per second. So, if you make the desired settings in this camera tab, for example, originally 60 frames per second is on the left, but in the case of 30 frames per second, by increasing the light exposure time a bit more, you can see that 30 frames per second is slightly clearer than 60 frames per second. If you think the environment where you are using PixieTool is a bit dark, you can increase accuracy by lowering the frames per second. Next, there is something called block filtering. If you go into the Expert tab in the settings, you will see a value for block filtering. The more you increase this value, the fewer misrecognized blocks there will be. However, the downside is that increasing this value lengthens the recognition time to 3. So, you should adjust this value according to your needs. If you find that increasing it too much lengthens the recognition time, you can lower it again. Adjusting this according to your preference can also help with calibration. Similarly, since Pixit also uses a camera, exposure settings are very important for other cameras as well. Exposure is quite crucial for Pixit too. Therefore, you can set Pixelmon to highlight areas with severe exposure. Here, at the top of the settings, select the Pixelmon Parameters tab, and then the Save the One Computer tab. Under that, you'll see the General tab, and in the middle, you'll find Highlight over Exposure. If you select this, the areas with Highlight over Exposure will be displayed on the screen like this. Using this, you can set the brightness-related values in the background and refer to it to check if the exposure is too high or not. Therefore, if you find that the exposure is too high and the accuracy seems to be dropping, you can check the exposure frequency using the highlighted section and then adjust the exposure level with the camera brightness. If you go back to the tuning tab, you will see camera brightness. By adjusting this brightness value, you can control the exposure level. It is best to adjust it so that the camera exposure area is minimized. Next, above the camera brightness we just set, there is something called mean brightness. This minimum brightness is used to ignore pixels with brightness values lower than this threshold. when recognizing pixels, and only consider those with higher brightness values to determine if they are correct pixels. So, if there are too many misrecognized pixels, you should increase the minimum brightness, and if there are too few recognized pixels, you should decrease the minimum brightness. Next, there is setting, the specific range of parameters and limits recognized during mode learning. In the Export tab, you can change the signature threshold value. Depending on how you set this value, the range of recognized objects can be broader or narrower. It might be easier to understand with a picture, but if you use the default value, it recognizes even the background. When you lower this value as much as possible, it only recognizes a very small area. By adjusting it appropriately, you can set it to recognize only the desired range of objects accurately. This time, we learned how to improve the accuracy of PC2 by using various methods for calibration. Next time I will continue to explain how to handle PC2 in more detail. See you next time.